This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Christel Temple, who teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on Africana Cultural Memory studies, Pan-Africanism, the intersection of history and literature, comparative Black literature, and Afroeuropean studies, along with numerous scholarly articles, including a value-added module for Introduction to Black Studies, Speaking in the Disciplines and Africana Market Value in Afrocentric Innovations in Higher Education. She is the author of Literary Pan-Africanism, History, Context, and Criticism from 2005, Transcendence in the Africana Literary Enterprise from 2017, Black Cultural Mythology from 2020, and co-editor with James Conyers Jr. of Muhammad Ali and Africana Cultural Memory from 2022. In this conversation, we discuss the distinctiveness of Black Studies methods and disciplinary work, transformative work of Black study in the classroom, and how Black Studies works both inside and outside traditional disciplines and areas of study. Good morning, Christel. How are you today?
I'm doing well, John. How are you?
Well, as I told you, it's funny you asked before I hit record. It is my last day of teaching in a very long academic year, so happy to put that behind me. Although the hour and 15 minutes I have to teach this afternoon feels like about 3 months of teaching, but I'm really happy to have this as part of the last day. I've been looking forward to our conversation. I think the research you do is really interesting and really key, really essential to the field of Black studies. And also, as also mentioned as we were chatting beforehand, having people who did their PhD and also work in the field of Black studies is just so important. And I also know that your PhD is from Temple, really such an historically important department. And so all of these things come together to really have me excited to have your voice on the podcast and your contribution to the series. So it's a long way of saying welcome to the Black Studies Podcast.
Thank you. Congratulations on your last day. And it's just a beautiful welcome to hear Temple celebrated. So thank you for that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, can't imagine the field of Black studies without Temple and without UMass. And so we absolutely know that. So we'll have a chance to talk about your research and how you think about Black studies, how you understand its sort of politics and intellectual life. But I wanted to start off really with a more personal question and ask you, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life, and what keeps you committed to this kind of work?
Yes, that I'm so glad you started with that question because as an editor, I see we don't have to do it as much in humanistic social sciences, but the positionality statement or even that participant observer lens that I see, it goes way back to me for geography. I am from Richmond.
Oh, you said geology. I was like, ooh, wow.
Geography. Whoops. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and I grew up, I guess I spent through third grade in the city, getting kind of the urban environment. I was bused. And then fourth grade, we moved to the county where my dad was raised. And that was, I think, 2 generations before. I guess my great-grandparents' generation, 2 sisters married 2 brothers. It was the type of neighborhoods you read about in some of the traditional Southern Mid-Atlantic and Southern African-American fiction, where we borrowed a cup of sugar, where I stopped dutifully to talk to my elderly widowed neighbor, knowing that we were building an intergenerational community. And my mother was Afro-German. And so my parents met, and they had these amazing stories, meeting in Germany. But we lived in this small area on the kind of off the Plantation Highway, Shirley Plantation, Curls Neck Farm, between Richmond and Jamestown, or Richmond and Williamsburg, Virginia. But it was a nice place to be, but I had the chance to say, okay, I'm a civil rights baby, if you will. I'm going to urban schools in Richmond, Virginia. I'm being bused. The school I went to for middle school was across the street from a housing project. We had profanity on the ceilings of the buses. We challenged to fight at school almost daily, like knock your mama off my shoulder, like knock my mom, this little thing you do where you push kids into each other. But the teachers, I was in gifted and talented, and the Black teachers loved us. They loved up on us. And then when I when I got to fourth grade in the county where we're, I don't know, 25% Black, I recall not being gifted and talented anymore. And I recall my fourth grade teacher trying to make sure that her little white girl teacher's pet got higher grades than I did. We would compare math tests. And I'm like, well, she marked mine wrong, but marked yours right. And so even growing up in Richmond with kind of down-home Southern Black parents, when my parents would have their parties when we were young, we would be in the room with our record player. We owned the 45 of James Brown's Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. And we would sing that. And so we knew, I think we had 50 kids on a school bus. There would be one little white girl, and the rest is a sea of Blackness. So I got to see both this urban landscape. I got to see the suburban landscape, suburban rural, where I ended up fourth grade through high school. But an interesting thing was I just remember watching Roots. I watched Roots probably fourth or fifth grade, and I just remember the big, heavy, salty crocodile tears running down my face at the Kunta Kinte Toby beating scene. And I started to put things together. That was probably the first instance where it's like, okay, I know we are African American, we're Black, we come from Africa, but that hadn't been a discourse. And I think for many of my generation, watching Roots was the first time that you're like, oh, there's Africa.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, my mother worked for Christian Children's Fund. You may remember Sally Struthers was their spokesperson, where you're sponsoring children, Ethiopia, all over the world. Your $25 a month can make a difference, that type of thing. But my mother had a sensibility that every field rep that came, field rep of color, Indian and an African, that was especially a gentleman from Kenya, she would bring him home for dinner. And so we had those encounters. And so and then in my 10th grade year of high school, I had an African American teacher who was African American history teacher. She tapped me to do the Black history. They had like a morning announcements and quizzes. I ended up doing that contest for 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. And when I graduated, you couldn't tell me that I wasn't going to be a history professor with and a track coach. Those are my two loves. And so, long-winded story, but there are a couple of points here. I got to we had been, my sister and I, honor students, we had been kind of cultivated by the Dean of Multicultural Affairs at College of William and Mary. She was Dean Hardy. She ran the Stewart Leadership Conference for Black students for at least, I think, 20 years. But she got us in there for summer programs and just trying to cultivate honor students in the area. So we ended up going to William and Mary. And one of those summers, I took a history class. And I learned, like, oh, I get to interpret history for myself? Are you kidding me? And I was sold on the history major, of course. But and then around my sophomore year, I took a class with a medievalist, and her name is Dr. Mary Ann Brink. She just earned her PhD. She taught medieval history. She was young. She was energetic. She bounced around the room like she was on MTV. And she would write 5 things in the left corner on the chalkboard. And then she would talk so enthusiastically and energetically about those things. And I was like, oh, later for being a teacher, I want to be a professor. And I think for a quick moment, I was like, oh, medieval history. She does it. I can do it. But it also layered with that summer, I applied and was accepted to a program at Virginia Tech that its objective was a state program to increase so-called minority, I don't use that word anymore, Afrocentric lexical refinement, but to encourage minority students to pursue PhDs in history. And that was the summer that I learned I was good at turning the page. I can sit and read any book. I'm disciplined to sit there all day, all night, turn the page till it's done. And we had to read 2 books a week. And it was a group of about a dozen African-American students, 1 Puerto Rican student. And we kind of pledged that, even with the colonial America and historiography courses we were taking there, we all kind of had this think tank for a moment. We, as a group, we were tired of taking European classes. We didn't want to take any more white classes as long as we lived. And that was where it was really fermented that I will get the PhD in Africana Studies. And so I ended up prioritizing Temple. And so, ironically, Dean Hardy, who did so much for my career, my early academic career, she said, "Well, you don't want to go and get a PhD in Africana Studies, because if you read the Chronicle of Higher Education program at Temple is kind of rot right now. There's a lot of pushback to a disciplinary PhD in Africana Studies." And I said, "No, I'll be fine. I'm a Leo. I'm invincible. I'll make my own way. But what I know is that I don't want to take any more European core to get to the Black stuff."
Hmm.
And she's like, "Okay, I'll write your letters." And I thought I was just going to take my barely 3.0 average in history and go to Emory. I applied to one school for graduate school for my master's. Didn't get in. I was like, "What?" And then rerouted, found UMBC. And that ended up being, the second plan A, where I was supposed to be all along, and had amazing nurturing with Miriam DaCosta Willis, who was in Afro-Hispanic literature, Ackland Lynch, the Ackland Lynch of Washington, D.C., Jonathan Peters, Willie Lamuse Smith, and it was exactly where I was supposed to be. And so by the time I got to Temple, UMBC's Master's in Africana Studies, which was a very short-lived program, had been so rigorous that I just felt invincible and like, ready, let's go. And so several things. The kind of traditional Black East Coast Mid-Atlantic experience that I had in Virginia ended up being, it had religion, spirituality, it had music, it had Black community, it had sociology, it had all of these things that once I became a scholar, I could recognize so many of the things that we teach taking place exactly in my life. And so DaCosta Willis was my mentor in my master's program. She said, "Look, your job is to create theory." And I said, "Pardon me?" She said, "Create theory." And then I get to Temple, and the Temple program says, "Your job is to write the books that are going to fill up the libraries, the monographs, and write the articles and the chapters, because in order to have a discipline of Africana Studies that's a standalone, autonomous department and field, we have to have the textbooks." And so that's kind of the story of my intellectual journey.
I love that. I mean, there's so many we're both educators, so it's obvious to say this in some ways, but I just love these moments of like real testimony to what education makes possible. I was really struck by, the medievalist, and that you even remember where she wrote the things on the side of the board. Right. And the energy. And like you said, I thought for a minute, like maybe medieval history. But I mean, I think these moments are important because they're part of this like massive like event that education can be, right? Which gets these refinements and that UMBC program. My sister teaches at UMBC, by the way.
Okay.
It's a kind of funny coincidence. Yeah. And that's, we'll have a chance, of course, to get into this in some detail. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say, but also that the hesitations around Black studies as a place to go, a place to teach, a place to get PhDs, a place to write books is such an important part of this podcast, but also such an important part of the back and forth, the ups and downs, the side roads of education experiences. Because, it also struck me as you were talking about all these things that boosted and enabled your imagination of who you could and wanted to be, but also that moment of like trying to take something away, right, around Black studies. So
yes,
we're all glad that you chose this. And let me ask you then, as a segue to the second question, which is how you understand or imagine the field of Black studies. And I always ask this in the context of its origin, which has a tension built into it. Part of the origin of Black studies is the demand by students that there be a place to study Black literature, Black art, Black history, Black sociology, that traditional disciplines hadn't done this. Black studies was going to be and has been that place on college campuses. But of course, in this moment, the late 1960s and early 1970s is a moment the radicalization of Black liberation struggle, where some of these distinctions between a classroom and a community, between books and political mobilization, between ideas and political prescription, were really being so deeply contested. And I think we inherit this tension of the origin of Black studies in a tension, not really a contradiction, but a tension between a commitment to intellectual life and a commitment to a certain kind of politics and a certain kind of vision of liberation struggle. So in that context, or that as a way of couching the question, I'm interested to hear you talk about what that portrait of Black studies is for you. What is it about? What is Black studies that guides you and that sort of grounds you as a thinker and teacher?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And so, several parts to that. So, first is let's look at 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. I don't think that we look well. We can with the work of Martha Biondi and Ibram Kendi, look at the Black student movement. But the point is that even looking at the Negro Studies movement, and Zizwe Poe writes about that too. But it's that these students got to go to their local universities, state schools, because we're now desegregating with all deliberate speed. I do an activity with my students where I lecture, and as I'm lecturing, I walk out the room and see if they can hear me in the hallways, because that was the basis of the Brown versus Board of Education, that they tackled graduate education. They tackled graduate education. They said, for graduate school, you could attend these southern universities, but you had to sit you had to sit outside in a closet, in a janitor's closet. You couldn't be in the same room. So if you can hear, you can't see the board, and so your education was handicapped. But I told my students, the Black students who desegregated these institutions, they didn't just say they knew Black history from their communities. And they got to these places and said, this is missing. We're paying too much. This is too much of an enterprise to not allow Black knowledge to be elevated and amplified in university space. And so we give more agency to the students. But aside from that, when I got out of Temple was Dr. Sante's work on Afrocentricity, Dr. Cato's work on the African-centered paradigm, Dr. Terry Kershaw's work on Afrocentricity, research methods, and sociology, that was really pushed at Temple. And so we were this pioneering generation. I graduated in 99. The first graduate was in 91. And so I claim being part of this kind of second generation, second wave of pioneers. But we had to study and learn, and we memorized Afrocentricity, its epistemologies, axiology, all of those things. But I did that to pass the test, to get the A in the grade. And then when I got my first job, which happened to be at UMBC as well, I was able to be in the right place in the right time with my PhD when my mentor retired. And they didn't make it easy. But I said, I'm going to go back and read the Afrocentric idea. I'm going to go back and read Afrocentricity. I'm going to go back and read Kemet Afrocentricity knowledge. I'm going to go back and read the Black aesthetic. And so these were core texts that were being taught in Temple's graduate program that were teaching us how to structure, how to stabilize and support what we're calling a discipline, which based on Asante's question at the end of people's dissertation defense, the question was, why couldn't this work have been done in another field? And if your answer is that, it could have been done in English, then why are you here? And so it was this real commitment to creating something new. And so I studied those. And then as an early career professor, I said, okay, I've got it. So imagine the first day of class for me, every class, every day of my career, every day, every class, I talk about Africana Studies. I tell my students the reason you're here comes from Terry Kershaw's, the language, we can take this credo. The credo is that we're here to create knowledge and inspire behaviors that will increase the life chances and life experiences of people of African descent in particular and of humanity in general. And that's a good paraphrase, partially quoted paraphrase from what Terry Kershaw gave us as this measure that can be applied to everything we say and do and teach and cover in Africana Studies. I tell them, your job, your goal here, I'm here to train you to be master communicators with the high cultural competency. Check. And then I tell my students there's an academic enterprise. You all have the privilege of being in this space in the middle of the day while people are working. but you're here getting educated, learning knowledge, talking, and having kind of reciprocal conversations. There's the academic enterprise and there's the practical enterprise. And that the being stewards of this inheritance, to have the opportunity to have an immersion experience in global Black content, means that you've got to find ways to talk about this, to get it out. Take a quote, take a line, take a theme, take a chapter, take a short story, take whatever you want. But it doesn't have to be a whole book and something that's very didactic where you can allow this knowledge to get out of the classroom. And then I talk about this is a discipline, and I avoid the use of the word interdisciplinary. I say multidimensional instead, and that's something that Raylan Rabaka from University of Colorado and I talk about, multidimensional. But I said there are 19 subject areas, and you're going to survey knowledge in these, and they are history, religion, politics, economics, sociology, psychology, creative production. Did I say psychology? Aesthetics, culture, communication, community development, philosophy, Pan-Africanism, gender, geography, education, linguistics, health, and science and technology. And so my students then get this structure and this frame that they have to kind of memorize this. And I said, we're going to deal with culture. We're going to deal with agency. We're going to deal with continuity. We're going to deal with worldview. We're going to deal with Pan-Africanism. We're going to deal with inheritance. And then I love how Karinga says, listen, we're not here to study just Black people's experiences. We're here to study Black initiative, global Black initiative, and experiences, because the experiences are the part where the self-defense comes in. And so the last part of this is that I've always been a little saucy Black girl, being bused, sent to the across town to the schools, being the middle child, all that injustice that comes with the middle child, where you're defending your rights. I have a high moral compass, and so I've been an activist forever. And so, weekly, monthly, I'm writing letters to Trader Joe's. I'm doing all of these things, taking a stand in public. But what the discipline is also giving us is this these tools for cultural survival. And so even saying cultural survival, notice I'm not saying self-defensive as much. It's part of that, but a protectionism. I like that word better. And so I teach my students the phases of racism, where you can go from acknowledging that something is different, and then distinction, preference, then discrimination, then prejudice, and then racism. So they can kind of itemize what's happening to them and capture the language that will allow them to have a sense of protectionism and agency in public in these social situations. And I also teach them the activist part of Africana Studies, Black nationalism. You got to have definitions and value, a sense of Black nationalism, but also knowing what European American cultural arrogance is. In self-defensive moments, when you hyphenate a white person, that's disarming alone. But European cultural arrogance, white skin color privilege, white supremacy, these types of language. And so what I found is that the students are thirsty for the knowledge. They're thirsty for new things that they're not learning in other classes. And that's our whole point of being a distinct department. But they're also interested in having the language and the terminologies and the points of reference that are going to improve their lives, because they can now label, name, speak boldly about the microaggressions and the racism and the prejudice and discrimination that they experience. Here. So those things all go together, and it's a beautiful thing. And so in addition to that, in my classroom, when my students memorize this, I say it, weekly, it comes up. So we do content, and then we apply it, and I'll say, well, look, pick which categories of these subject areas are we going to need to get every drop of analysis out of this text or this play or this speech. And I also teach them, there's a funny question, how many different ways can you teach Shakespeare? The discipline of Africana Studies is not there yet, because we have so much revisionist knowledge to engage with. We have so much present, contemporary, Afrofuturistic knowledge. We haven't even begun to explore all the things that we can. So there's always something new and interesting and vibrant and intersectional with these subject areas to discover. But I teach them that, number one, Africana Studies, the techniques that we use to just have this culturally rich experience, you can use too for your German background for your Indian background, for your Hawaiian background, anything. These tools work across cultures, but also we want to get to the point where we allow the Black text to be the universal. That to understand family dynamics, we don't have to go to Freud. We don't have to do this. To understand, sociology or psychology or gender, these Black texts can be the universal that everybody can read to get the human out of it. And so Asante's, not shift, but his new added focus has been humanism. And so that has been in our credo all along, to increase the life chances and life experiences of people of African descent in particular, and of humanity in general.
Thank you so much for that. It was a fantastic collection of insights that really, because I framed it as this tension between the sort of political and the intellectual dimensions of Black studies, and the way you pushed those two together, and with this credo, but also all these concrete examples and techniques and texts. I really appreciate that. That was extremely insightful. There's lots already that makes this an important contribution, but that alone, the clarity and precision of that, I really appreciate it. Let me follow up then and ask you about your own research a little bit in relation to Black studies. You have an interesting mix of interests: literary studies, cultural history and memory. It was funny because, you said, you had this connection early on to being an historian, and your first example is like, I do this with the students to make them see this historical moment of Brown versus Board of Education. But cultural history and memory studies, and womanism. And it's all animated by the sorts of things you were talking about, a Pan-African sensibility. And so I'm interested in how you see your research, this cluster of interests and critical frames, how you see it positioned in terms of the history of Black studies, but also what boundaries you think it pushes, what horizons do you think it's trying to open up?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for that. I grew up hearing the expression "jack of all trades." Then I was old before I heard the rest of it. Master of none, jack of all trades, master of none.
Yeah, I like
Af-
the first part. I don't like the
I like the
second part.
first part. I was like, yeah, that was really that was
It's a
really
little deflating.
disappointing. It is, but what happens is these 19 subject areas are what we cover. The first 7 come from Karinga. The next couple come from what Asante added. There's others that come from the introductory introductory text um, of James Stewart and Talmadge Anderson. And somehow, in Africana Studies, the introductory text do not function. They function in a different, more important, more let's go back to them cyclically type of way than they do in other areas where it's like, oh, 101, Psych 101, just go to introductory text. No, we need ours because ours are holding a lot of foundational, disciplinary, theoretical information, and it's information about categorization. And so even in a intro class, I will throw up the table of contents of almost a dozen Africana Studies text to allow students to see how knowledge about the discipline is forged, how it's presented by different people, and they can go from different texts and say what the philosophy or the school of thought on Black studies is in that moment. So another part is I became interested in. Well, let's backtrack. When I got admitted to UMBC's master's program in African American Studies, I'd always assumed that African American Studies was simply African American history. And here I am registering for the first semester. It was like intellectual thought, pro-seminar, research methods, and something else. But the next semester, it's like all literature, like comparative Black drama, comparative Black fiction, comparative Black poetry. And I was like, what is this? What is this? And so I was about to transfer to Morgan State, where they had Rosalind Terborg Penn. and their master's was in African American history. Because I'm an historian. And by that time, mind you, I'd already taken graduate coursework at William & Mary on American Revolution, graduate coursework at Tech on colonial America, graduate coursework on historiography, and I worked with James Axtell. I knew Native American history. That's the closest I could get to Black when I got out of College of William & Mary. And so knew a lot of this colonial history, but I was going to transfer. But then I was like, wait a minute, this seems familiar. And so what I didn't mention was that I'm a trained actor with Jazz Actors Theater of Richmond, Virginia, which previously was like the 125th Street Theater of Harlem under the director of Ernie McClintock. And when I got to and so I'd been training with him, working with him. And then I was at VCU, I was at home on break. I needed to go to the library. I was in a drama anthology and I saw his name, and he never, he was so humble. He never told us that he was a major theorist of the theatrical movement of the Black arts movement. And Ibby Sizemore from Vanderbilt has written a wonderful book on Ernie McClintock. But when I was in the master's program, I saw, I was like, oh, maybe I'll stay here because I can teach at the intersection of history and literature. I can teach literature through history. And so that opens up a lot of opportunity here. Yeah. But the jack of all trades is that in Africana Studies, we have to have competencies in all of these 19 subject areas because in the classroom, at any given moment, I'm giving an extemporaneous lecture on things I didn't plan to talk about, but that came up in discourse and needed viable directions. And so this vast training that people call interdisciplinary, I call it multidimensional, but it's through these multiple subject areas, means that we get training and we get training in these other areas, and we know enough to know what we don't know, or we know enough to know what we need to pursue further, taking a deeper dive into some of these are traditional disciplinary categories. The other part is that when I was in the history department, my first job at College of St. Rose was in the history department. That's where, Jimmy, what's his name, graduate? Fallon. Jimmy Fallon went to St. Rose, claim to fame. They closed a couple of years ago. But when I was in the history department as a PhD in Africana, guess what I taught? I taught history. I taught history periodization, historical priorities, historical paradigm shifts and revisionists and global, all those things in terms of the discipline of history. And so maybe sometimes I think that's what's missing, that in an Africana classroom, I am representing historians, I'm representing cultural theorists. I'm representing the formal literary, comparative Black literary critic, and those things. And so I'm aware that I have to do the extra work to make sure that I cover the bases in whatever research I do, following the breadcrumbs that will take me out of the discipline of Africana Studies into the interdisciplinary space of these other fields. And so that said, when I was finishing up with my master's work, I was interested in exile. So exile had been coming up with Nigerian Wole Soyinka, South African Dennis Brutus. It's coming up everywhere in the literature. And there was a train of thought, too, that African Americans are in a type of exile away from Africa in the United States. And that was my view. By the time and so later in my master's program, I came across a play by the Ghanaian playwright, Christina Ama-Ata Adu. When her father rubbed elbows with Nkrumah, and she met a lot of African Americans, but that was the first text that I encountered where an African writer created an African American character. And I was like, whoa. It brought me back to memories of Mr. Simon Ndunda, who was the field rep that my mother brought home. And it's like, because you had an African in our house, and he was like, yeah, we're all Africans, we're all Black. The reason you're here is because we're Black. And so we had a type of rapport, but that was a seed kind of that was planted in my consciousness when I was young, that Pan-Africanism is alive. And so I knew I'd write on exile when I got to Temple. And the more I studied and the more my dissertation proposal was shaped by Dr. Ella Forbes, who wrote my comp question with the language of the African vision of the African American experience, my dissertation ended up being on the African vision of the African American experience, a regenerative Pan-African discourse in contemporary West African literature. And so I scoured all the literatures and picked my friends and mentors' brain, and discovered that by 1999, when I submitted my dissertation, I found that there was a nice, small, containable corpus of scholarship from Nigerians and Africans where they had created African American characters in the text, and we could kind of give a chronology of that, and it became Literary Pan-Africanism.
Hmm.
And so, basically, with respect to the other areas, I I generally teach a lot of new text. I remember being at UMBC teaching 3 classes in a semester and teaching 14 new books that I've never taught before.
Mhm.
And if they're acclaimed, I don't have to read them all first. If they're acclaimed and we've done the research, like this book works. But I just was absorbing so many texts as quickly as I can to increase my knowledge base, but also having such vibrant sessions in class, as we tend to do, that's where my paper topics come from. And so having expertise in several areas, my antenna are really, excellent. And it's like ding, 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 ding. Oh, I can write about that. Ding, 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 ding. I can write about that. And so it's from this broad layering, the intersection of history, literature, and cultural theory.
Let me follow up just a little bit, just like a sort of twist or sort of parallel road, I guess, with this, and ask because I think it gives such a testimony to how your master's and doctoral work in Black studies has shaped how you think about a research project and do
Mhm.
a research project. How do you think it impacts your both your construction of and practice of a classroom? And I sort of think about this because, of course, your graduate work doesn't pass through in your employment. I mean, you said you'd been in a history department, but you're in Africana Studies now. So you don't pass through a discipline, right? So I'm also interested in how these very same dynamics that shape how you conceive and then do a research project affects how you construct and practice a classroom.
Thank you for that great question. I have a great answer to that. Um, the bottom line, we're concerned with rigor. And rigor, as some of my mentors, Joyce said, never stop reading. Dr. Cato said, exhaust the sources. I mean, it's your job as a researcher to exhaust the sources. And that's why Ngram Books has been a fascinating tool as I've gone back to revise some of my work where sources were not digitized. I can't find those 1 or 2 references, but I can now.
Hmm.
And it's changing almost every day. But in the classroom, I begin with uh, the framework of Africana Studies that I mentioned before. We don't talk about that in its entirety every day, but we come back to it, especially when students are trying to test, because I let them know that this is the toolkit for categorical thinking. If I give you an essay and you don't know what to write about, then walk through these subject areas. Is there anything historical, political, economic, religious, sociological, cultural, aesthetic, educational, gender based? They can walk through that, but um, in my classroom, I do if of the say 4 or 5 things that I do in that classroom, um, one part of that would be duplicated with what the English department is doing. We are doing a textual analysis. We're looking at literary conventions. We're looking at formal, formal analysis of a text. We're looking at influence and adaptation. And so it's solidly what we do in English department. But I structure it so then now let's move on. Now let's look at the historical elements. And so my students, we watch documentaries on the 1980s Ethiopian Civil War. We take a class and spend time on, and that was with Dina Mengistu's book, "The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears," for our reading of Elizabeth Nunez's Anna in Between about breast cancer. We spent a whole class acting like we're on CNN, where I'm at the desk, one student is the anchor on the mic, and she's interviewing my students so I said, come prepared with a 1 page of data, a data sheet on breast cancer and other diseases and illnesses that we've covered in this contemporary Caribbean course. And we spent the class on that, but we also show the line of demarcation between fiction and reality, fiction and history, fiction and documented experience. Um, the and then we touch the disciplinary Africana Studies part. I challenge sometimes my students' assignment is to create a program in Africana Studies. How are you going to get this out? A program for the community.
Say,
How are you going to get this out of the classroom? And so that can be an exam. That's a breakout time. That's coursework. And so we cover these many territories, these many functions in this classroom, and it's not done anywhere else, and it's certainly not done like that anywhere else. And so with if you're in a fine R1, there's some programs that are never gonna be touched. But then there are also programs where you're looking over your shoulder like, "Are they gonna shut us down one day?"
yeah,
Where you're constantly thinking about it. There are also legacy programs where you have people like me with, you have half your faculty, or at least a third, have PhDs in Africana Studies and represent the disciplinary Africana Studies autonomous departmental lens in these meetings. But we also see places where people want us to be more diaspora studies, and so there's tension here. All I know is that in my classroom, my students love the depth, and it's not duplication. And so at no point can you say that, oh, Africana Studies is just history, just like in my history class, or just literature. And I think that's a priority of what we have to do in terms of pedagogy, in terms of content, in terms of creativity, and continuity with respect to what came before. And I speak in complementary ways about my traditional disciplines. I mean, the traditional disciplines and my institutions that are doing similar work, because I want students to understand that, yes, that content from history is great. And look at how we do it here. And we're all working on the same enterprise,
yeah.
but this is what we do uniquely in Africana Studies. And so I need them to be ambassadors, which then increases enrollments, which then increases graduate students who are going to be prepared with PhDs in Africana Studies in the future.
And I think, just to pick up on that, really just to restate so much of what you said, but I love this, that when we're talking about something like Africana Studies department, that, as you said, doesn't have the protections of legacy departments, that sort of longer, if not, endless shelf life, and especially in this moment under real serious attack and possibility of close down and all of that. I think so often the way we professors think that a defense of Africana Studies is going to take place is solely in terms of how we can articulate it in a letter or in a meeting with the dean. But I love that you've sort of laid out there how important it is to be able to point to our students and say they know exactly what is singular and unique about what they did in this department. So it's like proving the legitimacy of, not proving, but defending the legitimacy of the discipline through our practice with our students instead of through our strongly worded letters and emails. And I mean, all of these things are necessary in times of defense at a university, but I'm so happy to hear you really draw back what we show our students, and if they can speak to that, then we've been successful, and we can make a really strong case. If they can't, this is always my thing too. If our students can't say why they did it in Africana rather than history, then we're in trouble if, it comes time to defend ourselves and try to survive as a department.
Yes, when I was department chair, I was talking to the dean, and he said, "Well, Africana Studies is not international." I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "No, it's not." I was like, "It's always been since day one." He says, "No, it's not." I said, "Yes, it is." He says, "Well, no one told me." I said, "Well, I'm telling you now."
Yeah, that
And
got cured right now.
yeah, no. And then when I was chair, I made a point that whenever I spoke on behalf of the department, beyond the department, I would give a quick definition. I was like, Africana Studies is a systematic and scientific study of people of African descent, blah, 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 blah. In our department, we have such a vibrant roster of faculties, French, Caribbean, blah, 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 Latino, da, da. And then I had a woman, and so then that would bring people to say, hey, you know, we have a doctoral program in contemporary urban European studies. We didn't realize that your faculty do work here and there. And I was like, yes, I do Afro-European studies. My other colleague does this. And so it was a way to, somehow the word silo becomes an accusation when you hear the dean say it. Like,
Yeah,
your
that's always
department's
wild.
siloed, but it became a way of doing PR for the department where, other departments would collaborate now because they never gave thought to Africana Studies doing this. Even a graduate student from another department, I think she was in French, she walked in Africana Studies years ago, and we had posters, framed posters of everybody's book, and she's like, "I didn't know Africana Studies wrote books." It's like, wow. Imagine
Yeah.
that. But
Wow.
still, PR growth and, not the shameless self-promotion, if you will, but just really advocating for our department and standing firm on what we are, not falling for the okey doke. There's a lot of okey doke out there.
Yeah. It is interesting the way silo becomes a an instrument of war, it's just that switch because often what it means is distinctiveness.
How
You
about
know?
that?
But,
How about that?
just that word switch, all of a sudden, everything's in peril, but well, I have 2 last questions for you.
Okay.
This first one is sort of reflecting on the history and future of the field of Black studies. What do you think that Black studies has done particularly well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well historically?
Okay. I'm a Black nationalist. I remember Black nationalism being described as you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. If you're part of the problem, get to the back of the line. I
Mhm.
can't run the university like that, but no. So back to the charges of Miriam DaCosta Willis, create theory. Your job is to create theory. Check. We've done that well. Back to Asante. Your job is to write the books, fill up the library with sources that can be taught in classrooms, with textbooks, with studies that can stabilize the work. Have we done that? Check. Our allies and adjacent disciplines working on the global Black experience have done that. And so we have been a beacon to claim not only an autonomous Africana Studies departmental space in the university, but a beacon to also maintain um, an encouragement for other departments to also make sure that they don't try to leave all of the instruction about Black people of African descent, just to our department. We can't accommodate 19 subject areas and the whole wide world, all of these continents. We can't accommodate all of that, and so other people need to be doing this work on behalf of their department from their own perspective. So we've done that well. Our classes have been enrolled. We've maintained high enrollments despite the occasional Chronicle article that says, despite high enrollments and despite tremendous growth over the past 2 decades, Africana Studies is still struggling. That's not true. But that's propaganda for when the deans want it and when the presidents need it to then shift us around like black checks, like checks pieces. What do we want to happen with our Black people in the university? And so we have withstood all of that. Our classes are still full. We have a lot of vibrant thought. We have a lot of vibrant um, allies and adjacent sites that do Black studies work. What we haven't done well is and in a way, it's almost like the victim being required to fix the problem, but I still see people being territorial in the university and competing for Africana content to the detriment of the Africana Studies department. And so, for example, I remember I'm familiar with someone who wanted to teach a very Black course in American Studies, and Africana had to approve it, and I did not approve it. And I said, well, work with us. Teach the course, but do it like this. That way it's a win-win versus you winning and us losing. And so what was said was, well, I'm tired of teaching white students. I want Black students in my class. I want this. And I said, then you should have gotten a job in Africana Studies and not American Studies because you can't have your cake and eat it too. And so I think in the Black nationalist perspective, what we haven't done well is I think at times we've been too nice. And being too nice is often being too uninformed. And being uninformed is about knowing the leadership and what the answer to some questions are yes or no questions when the dean asks you. And a lot of times the answer has to be no. And so I've seen this recently too, that Africana faculty are not as vocal as we often need to be to protect our borders, to protect our department. And it's not to protect, it's protect in terms of the sanctity of what we do. And so we have contributed a bit to us getting watered down. And so I see this in our professional organizations where we are not celebrating our own, that we're going out and giving awards to people who have never been to our conferences because that's my friend or that's Black content. And so even in those instances, you end up kind of watering down some of the pure intentions of what the discipline has been. And so I see that we've done mostly things well. And I don't know where to put this, but I've also I'm not sure, I kind of am, who's responsible for this, but my Black history, I end up having a theme every year for my Black history lectures, like something that's kind of needling at me that I want to study more. And this year it was the library's E185.4 section. So I remember when people still walk the stacks, you go to get a book, and then you sit there. I think everybody does this, I don't know. You sit there for hours longer than you plan to be there because you see so many good books. So walking the stacks of the E184.5s shows that that's where Black Studies scholarship begins. And if you just follow down to the very first text, you're going to see those 1960s conference proceedings on what should Black Studies be. You're going to see these edited collections. You're going to see just this. That's part of the 50 sources I drop on the table for my graduate students in the Critical Africana Pedagogy course. And somehow we have forgotten that there's nothing new under the sun. And so in terms of citations and exhausting the sources, at times we're not going back far enough to realize that someone said that in 1967, and you think it's new, or you don't know it exists at all, and now you're asking me in 2026, well, what is Black Studies? We're going to get a Black Studies minor in the English department. I'm like, we are Black Studies. It's just been the moniker has changed. And so I find that we're in this moment where Black Studies, the definition of Black Studies is not based on the empirical research tracing back the continuity of what Black Studies was when we coined those terms, what it has been, what the arguments have been. And so I find that scholars are inadvertently, because I don't think it's intentional, taking shortcuts, assuming and ignoring the historiography of Black Studies going back from its origins. And I'm talking about this 1960s origins. And if you're really handling business, you're going way back to the Negro Studies movement. You're going to Du Bois. You're really going back to Clark Atlanta and all these other studies. But I find that we're shortchanging the legacy of Africana Studies. And so that means the editors and the peer reviewers are not being as rigorous as they should be to ask for citations and bibliographic continuity trails for the contentions that people make right now. So that's just a couple of ideas I have on that.
So maybe it's already an answer or beginning of a further elaboration for my last question,
okay,
which is what is the sort of thinking in a Black Studies context? What is the question you would want us to be asking, or issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
The largest issue is so we have 20 doctoral programs in the country, and I think 2 or 3 are dual programs or immersed in other disciplines, but we've got 20 doctoral programs. And so the question is, where are the graduates of these doctoral programs supposed to work? Because I find myself in places where I hear that the person with the PhD in Africana Studies is not prioritized as a candidate in Africana Studies for an Africana Studies search. And I'm floored. So that is a question. And I know in Africana Studies, in our professional organizations, the Afrocentric circles, there's this description called disciplinary suicide. So disciplinary suicide is when you decide that there's only one and only home for me in the university, and that is a standalone Africana Studies department. And so I find, though, that we have the quest for jobs. When I was early career, I applied to everything I was remotely qualified for because we need jobs. But so the next question is, when are we going to stop looking at the Department of Africana Studies as a backup job for scholars in traditional disciplines so that their claim is that I can go into sociology or Africana studies? Well, if that's where you get the job, fine, but also can we have some kindness, some thoughtfulness, some deeper understanding of what the discipline needs to be stabilized, to give credit to those who, like me, sacrificed to go in Africana studies, get the PhD in Africana studies, knowing that the road was going to be harder. And so that comes with the next follow-up question. Um, and again, I'm familiar with the case where someone called me too Africana for Africana. Well, would I be too history for history, or too psychology for psychology? Too math for mathematics?
Mm-hmm.
But in Africana, I'm familiar with a search committee meeting where it was proposed that, let's say we prioritize scholars with the PhD in Africana. And then a scholar blurted out, well, that means people like me won't be able to get jobs here. And the commentary was like, yes and no. And so the yes part is like maybe, because there's been a shift. You have 20 doctoral programs. But the other part is that, are we not aware that just like I taught history when I was in a history department, and if I were to go back to a history department now, I would then have to teach the same content, but based on the priorities of the field of history. I would shift.
Exactly.
And so why are people not aware of the learning curve that it takes then if you decide to not commit disciplinary suicide, but transition from a traditional discipline to Africana studies? Where is the respect and understanding that you now realize that there is a learning curve, that you should study and understand what Africana is beyond just the benefit of having a job where you can teach mostly Black students, where you can teach content? Another question becomes too, what is our commitment to the curriculum of Africana Studies? I'm talking about the four corners. If I just gave 19 subject areas, and these come from our organizational foundational text that says, in a pushpin sort of way, have you checked all the boxes that now show a competency in Africana Studies, this global study of people of African descent? Have you learned or covered or taught as much as you possibly can? Or is Africana Studies a job for you, a site for your boutique scholarship, and that your impression of coming into an Africana Studies department just that, boom, I got the job, I don't have any commitment to understand the core of what's in intro textbooks, which means that I could be able to inform and backtrack and amplify the foundations of the discipline in your current teaching. To go back and say, hey, this is this. So this is agency. This is drawing from these subject areas. This is fulfilling Terry Kershaw's credo, increases life chances. This is why you're doing this. And so I find in a lot of classrooms, people are not even using the words Africana Studies or Black Studies or continuity or stewardship and understanding what broadly is kind of a sense of dutiful survey, that you go back and you read the core text in this field. And even if you're in two fields, psychology and Africana Studies, if you're in an Africana Studies, what if colleague used to say, what's the name on the door? What's the name on the door? That means that is that's the set of assumptions, priorities, methodologies, epistemologies, and disciplinary worldview that we have hired you to teach in order that we can all be on one accord in what we're giving the students in the degree that we claim we're giving the students. And so those are some of the questions and concerns that I have in closing.
I love that. Thank you. That's such an important place to wrap up, and it's such an important claim to make. I have to say, as someone who's still dealing with the aftermath of this fight around a particular hire, around the idea that we ought to actually weight very heavily, if not absolutely gatekeep, our job candidates, asking that they have a degree in the field. I mean, that was such a fight, but it's for reasons that you have laid out, not only in this final comment piece, but throughout this podcast, we've really just laid out the depths and historically as well as intellectually and politically, the depth of that question and the urgency of it. It just really is going to make this such an important contribution to the series. And I'm really happy that we found time, Christel. And I'm thankful for your time, but your thoughtfulness and really decisiveness in this conversation is just really special. So thank you for that. I appreciate it a lot.
You are very welcome. Thank you for this opportunity, John. Thank you.
All right. Well, you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.